Good afternoon, everyone. Now, Amos Zweig and myself, we are back for a new video conversation. And today, we thought that we could discuss the topic of evolution. So evolution is a very famous theory or hypothesis, or what some would call it a fact, though that would be disputed. The theory about how life, and especially how life in today's forms, the complexity of the different species, etc., how that came to be, evolution is a very famous and popular theory concerning that issue. And the evolution theory also has implications for many other issues about, you could say, human nature and the nature of the world and other things. And it also has relevance when it comes to religion and its incompatibility with certain doctrines of Holy Scripture and other things. So it's a very relevant and interesting issue to talk about. So Amos, we could then begin with trying to define what evolution is all about. What is it essentially? Because in order to discuss it, we have to be able to distinguish it from other things and you could say have a mutual understanding of the same concepts.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, and good plan to start with a definition. So I think there are a couple of important criteria for the theory of evolution, and one of the criteria is that it has the goal to explain the existence of life which we observe in the world by strictly material means, so without using any kind of reference to God or some supernatural being or intelligence that pre-existed before the material universe and created life. So it tries to explain how complicated living beings could have emerged just out of the more simpler constituent elements of, let's say, the world. So things like sunlight and oxygen and water, these things already exist, and how they came about, this would be more a problem for astrophysicists or some other theory like Big Bang and so on. But evolution is mainly concerned with how do we get complex living entities out of simple inanimate substances.
Thank you for that definition, Amos. Right. So yes, it seems to me that evolution could perhaps be understood in this very broad sense, talking about the origin of nature itself, generally speaking, and some might perhaps include the whole theory of the Big Bang in order to have this comprehensive view of matter and the universe. Though, as you also pointed out, evolution seems to be concerned with the, you could say, the origin of the kind of species and life forms that exist in the world today. And that seems to me to be the whole issue that, for instance, Charles Darwin was concerned with in The Origin of Species, though I haven't read that book myself yet. So I would perhaps define or understand evolution to be the idea that the diversity of life and different species that exist today on Earth have a common ancestor that lived a long time ago, somewhere around 1 billion and some millions years. I think, I'm not entirely sure, but at least in that time frame or time scale. And then from that one ancestor, there was this gradual evolution where this primitive organism gradually changed, and through this change became these different life forms that we see today, all these offsprings of this common ancestor that gradually changed, evolved. And the means by which this evolution took place was natural selection and mutation. At least those are very two essential features to the process of evolution, that there are some mutation concerning the copying of genes from the parent to its offspring, and natural selection. In other words, that due to the condition of the environment and the natural state of things around that organism, some organisms will survive more or better or live more successfully than others due to some of the features that they possess. And therefore, this is natural selection. You will see that offsprings will evolve according to this. And thus you have, through this means, over a long time scale, you get the different life forms that we see today. So this is not just various species within one biological kind or family, but all of the species, all of the kinds of animals evolve from this common ancestor, including human beings. So that would be my understanding of the theory of evolution, or Darwinian evolution.
Yes, I guess I would agree with this account that you have given. These are essential features of the theory of evolution that you have described here, namely the idea of all life having one or at least very few common ancestors. We will get to that a little bit later. And then all of these life forms basically evolving out of mutation, which is a quite very improbable error in the copying of this life form in its reproduction, and then having natural selection, which means that certain life forms are better adapted to the environment in which they find themselves, and therefore these have more children and spread. Yes, so I think these are basic points to make, and also something that many people tend to miss, so I want to emphasize it right in the beginning, is the problem of large and small numbers. So mutation is very improbable, and a beneficial mutation is even very much more improbable. So it's almost impossible that a beneficial mutation will occur. But then when you talk about millions or billions of years, and at the same time billions of copies of this particular, let's say, bacteria or some protein or something, then the chance, because you have a really large number multiplied by a really small number, and so it's intuitively quite hard to deal with that. So that's also something that has to be kept in mind.
Interesting point to put up there. Yes, I think the idea which is integral to evolution, that you could say the accumulation of mutations over a huge time scale, and you accumulate a lot of them, that will produce eventually substantial change in some animal. And I think also this is the key to some of the you could say disagreements or discussions about evolution, both from a scientific and philosophical point of view, because there is the question of how far can a mutation go, to what extent can it actually both either one mutation or a collection of mutation, even a very large collection of mutation, to what extent are they able to transform or change an animal or a kind of animal? And I think this is a central point of contention or disagreement when it comes to whether evolution is true or false, or rational or proven, or irrational or unproven, non-proven. So I could also now mention the distinction that critics of evolution would make between what is called microevolution and macroevolution. So microevolution is generally the phenomena that an animal changes genetically due to, for instance, these mutations as we were talking about. And thus you can have variations within that kind of animal. And an example of this would be dogs. Today you have many different types of dogs, you can say, like Chihuahua or many other animals, many other dogs which are different from that specific type of dog, but they're all dogs. They all are within one biological family, the dog type or kind, so to speak. So these variations within the dog kind would be example of microevolution. And macroevolution would be the idea that you could have some animal change into a completely different kind of animal. So we're talking about differences between kinds, or in the biological taxonomy, the modern categorization of animals within the family range, where that the kinds are that which distinguishes dogs and cats, human beings, and say amphibians, things like that, where you're talking about completely different kinds of animals. So that would be an important distinction, because it is quite true. I think virtually everyone would agree that genetic changes and genetic variation in animals do in fact exist. We have many examples of that. But whether these genetic changes can be so drastic that they can actually change the kind of animal that we're talking about, that is another question. So yeah, I think this distinction would be useful to these issues.
Yes, very well. I think that's also the big issue in the debate between, let's say, evolution, people who defend the theory of evolution and people who hold to a theory of some form of intelligent creation or intelligent design. The big question is about macroevolution, as you have defined it before. So this question, did human beings evolve out of fish or something like that? Of course, it's a little bit more complicated than just this statement, but yeah, that's the point where people disagree about. So would you think it's useful to also present the view of intelligent design or creation a little bit before we go further?
Yes, sure. That could be useful to do. So the idea of intelligent design and the idea of, you could say, creation, that things on earth are created by a god, that is professed by many, including myself, though there would be some variations within a worldview. For instance, there are some people who would say that aspects of the theory of evolution is correct. However, they would also say that there is also an element of an intelligent God designing and intervening in the process of nature to bring about the complexity that we see in nature today. While you could say the view of biblical creationists, like myself, the view would be that the different kinds of animals that exist today were specially created by God out of nothing at a specific point in time. And then these kinds of animals, they had microevolution. They had these genetic variations within their own kind. Like I said, dogs have all these variations, but the dog kind was created by God. So essentially, the different kinds of animals were created by God. Their essences and DNA and all that were given by God in that point of time in the past. And also he created human beings, especially Adam from dust, and then Eve from a part of the body of Adam. So that view would be then, of course, incompatible with the theory of evolution, which would posit that the different kinds of animals evolve from a common ancestor, while biblical creation says that no, the different kinds of animals were created as the different kinds immediately from nothing by God. So yes, that would be a very brief, you could say, introduction to what creationism and the idea of intelligent design is.
Yes, thanks for this definition. I would also want to mention that in this conversation that we are going to have here, we are not going to agree. So I think the point of our conversation shouldn't be to try to agree on the way life on Earth came about, or to convince the other person necessarily about the position we hold ourselves, but just to present both positions as well as we can, and to kind of probe the other position by asking certain questions that seem to be problematic in the theory of the other, and thereby kind of giving like a broad range of possibilities for the audience to just educate themselves and then decide what they find convincing and what not.
Right, yes. So there are various issues then which can be brought up. I would say that there are both philosophical and scientific arguments against the theory of evolution. And also, for the record, I am not an expert in biology and the related fields. So when it comes to different scientific issues, this is surely a topic which I hope to deepen my knowledge in the future. So, but at least I could bring up some scientific issues that could be very relevant to evolution. So would you like to talk about some of the philosophical issues or objections about evolution and then move on to the scientific, or what do you think we should do?
If it were okay with you, I would actually like to give a short presentation of the theory of evolution as I have learned it from the book The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, because I think it's a good account, and I think many people are quite confused or have a kind of straw man notion of evolution in their mind when they talk about it. So I think this might be helpful as a starting point. I will not take too long for it, and then we could go into philosophical as well as concrete problems with both theories.
Sure.
Very nice. So then I will start my very fancy presentation here. So I guess you should see this image now here. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the basic idea of how it might be possible that life could have evolved out of inanimate substances. Again, according to The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, which I found a very interesting book. So the idea is kind of, as a starting point, we have Earth a couple of billion years ago, and there is an atmosphere and there is water. And the atmosphere consists mostly of oxygen and nitrogen, and the water consists of H2O. But there are other kind of gases or molecules that exist up in the atmosphere and also in the water. So this is kind of methane and what's it called? Ammonium or something like that, and CO2. So, okay, and then the water moves because we have flood and the opposite, and we have some lightning sometimes, and we have ultraviolet rays coming from the sun. And so now this should move over here, yes. And so this has already been verified in a laboratory experiment that if you take such a setting and you kind of move the water and you add ultraviolet and some electrical current, after time, these methane and this molecule, they are being split up, and sometimes they combine in more complex molecules, which are the amino acids that are the building blocks of proteins, basically. And so these can occur just by having this setting for a long time. So you start to get amino acids in this ocean, basically. And then as we go on, these amino acids sometimes start to combine to more complex molecules. And so these here, I forgot how they are called, but these are actually the building blocks of DNA or RNA or more complex protein structures. And this has also been verified in an experiment that if you leave this tank for just a while longer, then these building blocks start to emerge. So this is kind of what evolutionists call this primordial soup. There is different kinds of amino acids and building blocks of proteins or combinations of proteins. Different molecules are swimming around in this water. And then as we move on, sometimes along the coast where the water evaporates, these things would become more dense. So many amino acids would be in a small place. And then by some chance, we get just different kinds of molecules that consist of amino acids or some basically proteins. We get different kinds of proteins just because the amino acids are close together and they have this certain parts of a amino acid attract certain other parts, and so they kind of link together. And then this is basically not very interesting yet, but then at some point, one remarkable molecule, if you want to call it like that, comes into being basically by chance. But this is, again, if you take a lot of amino acids and a lot of time, then it's not impossible that such a molecule should occur. And this molecule has this special characteristic that it can kind of link or attract other amino acids to itself and thereby build a copy of itself, kind of just parallel attached to it. And then it can build a third copy attached to the second, and so forth. And so what starts to happen is you start to get this larger structure that is growing out of always the same molecule just being repeated one next to each other and kind of sticking together by some electromagnetic or microelectric forces. And then at some point it becomes too large, and some mechanical or under the influence of ultraviolet or some lightning or something, the molecule breaks apart. So now we have two of these large structures consisting of different copies of the same molecule. And now, as you see, this, because this has the property of kind of collecting amino acids and building these copies of itself, all of the other building blocks become very much less common in this ocean. So we get the kind of a situation where most of this of these proteins are arranged in this kind of way in this ocean. And now at some point it is also more probable than zero that there will be some error when you copy, or when this molecule just copies itself. Perhaps some protein that shouldn't actually belong here will still stick here. And so a different structure of proteins that can produce copies of themselves starts to emerge. And then as we continue and this breaks off, then the ocean kind of looks a little bit like this. And perhaps at some point, even a third type of molecule by chance comes into existence and starts making copies of itself. And so this is the starting point of evolution, basically, because you have now basically already this here was the starting point, because you have one entity that just by physical and chemical forces makes copies of itself. And then you have now two different entities or three, and now these things start to be in competition with each other, because and here we come to this point here, a molecule that will be able to exist in this configuration, or to exist in a relevant number. So there might be some special molecule existing just once, but that's irrelevant because these others make more and more copies of themselves. And so one important characteristic of such a molecule is it should be able to be stable. So if it decays very quickly because of ultraviolet, then it will not exist in a large quantity in this ocean because it will always fall apart. And also, if one of these molecules can make copies faster than another, then there will be more copies of this molecule after a given time. And also important is that the molecule can actually make accurate copies of itself, because if it isn't well suited to do that, then it will create all kinds of different molecules, and so it will not be more present, or more present in this ocean. And so basically here already we have now a situation of natural selection, because certain molecules just by chance will be better structured in this environment of this primordial soup to make copies of themselves. And so there will be more copies of this molecule after a certain time. And that's basically how the idea of the theory of evolution, how everything started. And then there are now certain strategies that can evolve in this setting. So for example, if at some point a molecule comes to be which is able to break apart other molecules and use the building blocks to make copies of itself, then of course this will spread throughout this primordial soup. And so this is basically the origin of what we call animals, things that eat other living things. And then there is another strategy. If any molecule by chance happens to increase the likelihood of this thing here that happened very much in the beginning, that some CH4 and some NH3 and some water will produce an amino acid if they are close to this specific molecule, kind of acting like a catalysator, or however you say this in English, then this molecule will also have more building blocks to produce more copies of itself. And this is kind of the strategy of plants that use the sunlight and water and CO2 and different stuff that exists just as inanimate substance to build basically building blocks for themselves. And then you can keep going on, like if you have now one molecule that is capable of breaking apart another molecule and using it to make copies of itself, then if a molecule would be able to kind of build a primitive wall around itself so that it cannot be broken up, then this would again spread through this ocean. Or perhaps 2 or 3 of these molecules will just, when they are in the coast of the ocean where all of this stuff is more densely concentrated, they will start to function better when they are close to each other. And perhaps at some point they will function even better when they build a wall around each other. And now it's important to understand that these molecules do not consciously decide to build a wall. It's just if one of these molecules changes by accident so that it has the effect of producing such a wall out of some proteins or some things, some molecules in this original soup, then this entity will produce more copies of itself and therefore will exist in a larger quantity in this ocean. And so the idea is that by this gradual process of increasing complexity, these molecules start to build kind of like robots inside which they sit and which they kind of use to protect themselves and build more copies of themselves. And these robots would be what we call living beings, like bacteria, like plants, like animals. And this evolved from the simple to the complex. By perhaps learning to move, this would be a large advantage. And so that's basically the theory of evolution as far as I understand it.
Well, that was a lot of different issues and thoughts that you brought up there, even with illustrations and things like that. But I would ask, for instance, the question, are many of these considerations, are these based on speculations, or would you say that there are scientific observations that confirm this process?
As far as I know, and also, as you said before, I am also not an expert in evolution or biology. What I know from this book of Richard Dawkins is that the generation of proteins or building blocks of proteins in this ocean 3 billion years ago, that has been reproduced in a laboratory. But the other things that I have talked about to my knowledge, are speculative. They haven't been yet empirically kind of reenacted or observed. So that's as far as I know.
Interesting. Well, so yeah, I know of one experiment in the 1950s. I cannot remember the name right now, but an experiment which supposedly would show that you could have building blocks for life. But if I remember correctly, that experiment was only able to produce a few amino acids. I don't think they ever got to the point of creating a protein. And also there were very specialized conditions which made it possible to create those amino acids. And some intelligent design adherents would criticize the experiment for because that experiment had certain conditions to make that process possible, but that those conditions would not exist on Earth in that ocean billions of years ago. Though I'm not an expert into, okay, what kind of conditions, so that I'll have to look more into that. But there is one point about proteins that I would make. There is this one argument that in order to form proteins, it is absolutely necessary to have DNA, because in the process of forming proteins, you need to have amino acids that are properly sequenced, that are sequenced in a specific order, and you need to have a very complex form of sequence in order to form one specific protein. But it's necessary to have DNA to, so to speak, guide the amino acids and give them literal information to sequence themselves properly. And also it's also true, in addition, that DNA needs already existing proteins in order to be able to contribute to this process, because DNA by itself doesn't do anything. It's like a CD. A CD contains information, but unless you have a CD player, that information cannot be utilized in any way. So DNA needs already existing proteins in order to utilize the information, so to create that process of properly sequenced amino acids. So this will thus be an example of proteins and DNA both needing each other in order to form, and therefore it's impossible to have one evolve independently of the other and the other way around, rather than both had to be present from the beginning in order for any form of protein formation to exist at all. So that would be an argument that you need something to create both simultaneously, because you can't have one without the other. And this reflects this general principle called irreducible complexity. We could perhaps go more into that principle, but I'll let you comment on this first.
Yes, no, thank you very much. Good starting point for our debate about this theory. And I think it would be very good to talk about this notion of irreducible complexity, which you have just now brought up, because I feel that this is also one of the very, very misunderstood aspects of evolution and of critics of evolution. So you have sent me once a video, and there was this notion that bees, like the small animals, they need flowers in order to live, and flowers need the bees in order to propagate. And so neither one could have evolved without the other. And so you cannot just say that bees have evolved because they needed flowers first, but flowers couldn't have been there first because they also needed the bees. And so in a similar notion, you have now said that amino acids need proteins to be correctly sequenced into amino acids. Proteins need DNA so that they can be built in the correct sequence, and DNA needs proteins in order that it can be read and copied, or that proteins can be built from the DNA instruction. And I think what's important here is to understand is that this is not an argument against evolution, because evolution in many cases, in fact, in all cases, includes this, I think it would be called co-evolution. So things evolving together. And as a simple example, you could say, how can a modern state have evolved out of a simple hunter-gatherer society? Because in a modern state, we have division of labor, but I cannot go and become a mechanical engineer unless there are farmers and plumbers and construction workers and all of these people. So how could there ever have been a mechanical engineer? And the answer is that, of course, the division of labor evolved over time. In the beginning, everybody was kind of a hunter-gatherer, and then one of them started to make bow and arrow because he was good at that, and the other one started to go hunting because he was good at that. And so kind of the complexity built up over time. And the same thing would be in this theory that I have presented. In the beginning, there was just the first proteins came about by chance. And this took a long time. This took perhaps, I don't know, a couple of 100 million years. But again, you have an entire ocean full of amino acids that are kind of drifting around and bumping into each other. And when two of them just in the right constellation with the right velocity bump into each other, then they will stick together, because this is actually a stable entity in this surrounding that on Earth. So proteins can actually exist, and that's why when they meet just right, then they will stick together because of these microelectric attractions. And now this took a long time, and in the beginning it was just completely random, and the evolution of a DNA that can be read and produce specific proteins is already a long step away, or many steps away, from the theory that I have presented. This is already quite sophisticated. But in the theory of evolution, it would be said that the protein synthesis and DNA evolved simultaneously from simple to more and more complex, up to this point that we have today.
Well, many things that could be talked about there. When it comes to the idea of division of labor, well, I wouldn't say that's a good comparison, because with the development of more complex societies, well, first of all, you could still have everyone being, say, hunter-gatherers in the beginning, and then some people beginning to be farmers, but there is nothing in that process which suggests that the farmers need, or all the way around, that the hunter-gatherers need the farmers in order to exist. Rather, the farmers are, you could say, something that they can have in addition to the hunter-gatherers. So it seems to be something very different from a process in which both, with you have two things that are absolutely necessary and need each other in order to do anything useful and have any progress whatsoever. And it seems to me that, well, even with a long time scale, the idea of something simply being sequenced, well, it seems so necessary that there must be some information like DNA guiding it, because otherwise there would be nothing intrinsic to the process of amino acids to bring them together in a specific order. And also you could say that when it comes to DNA, this is a separate issue of how DNA formed, because the very interesting thing about DNA is that it actually involves or contains coded information about what kind of animal there is and what kind of features and characteristics that animal will have. So it's actually coded information, and there is no scientific experiment or observation, at least that I know, that can show information being generated by some natural process. And this is an argument that several intelligent design adherents would use, that the only way that information can be generated that we know of, and you could argue that this is the only way philosophically it's possible as well, that the only way that happens is by an intelligent mind. Like information in a book comes from an author, programmed language in a software in a computer comes from a programmer, etc. So the only way we know that information can come about is through some intelligent mind that can generate that information. So that would also be an argument for intelligent design. So also when it comes to the question of bees and flowers needing each other for survival and existence, I know you mentioned it, but I'm not sure if you try to come up with a counterpoint to that situation, because I would think that that's a good example of something where both need each other, because it seems to me inconceivable that you can have, say, bees that somehow evolve without having flowers from the very beginning, and another way around. It seems impossible, and perhaps even more impossible, that amino acids and DNA, because at least amino acids can, at least in theory, exist on its own, and DNA exists on its own. But bees and flowers cannot exist on their own. So yeah, so when there are cases where there is no way that both can exist without the other, then we have a problem here, because even though you have billions of years, and even though you have many bees and many flowers, the principle would still apply. Yeah, and there are other examples of irreducible complexity which could be brought up, but at least those are some issues.
Yes, to address your question, there were many good questions. I would start with the problem of information being generated by a natural process, which you said is, as far as we know, impossible. And I think that's the beauty of the theory of evolution, that it's one way in which this process can be explained. And again, of course, it cannot explain the coming into being from zero to the complete building manual of a complex life form, or a book, or a computer, or something like that. But it can explain how one little step can lead to the next little step. So I will just very quickly show this image here again, where we had, as you said, speculative, but there was perhaps a molecule that had the property of attracting different amino acids to itself, so that these would build a new copy of this molecule which already exists here. And so in my mind, this molecule, if you want to say so, contains the information of how copies of itself can be built in this environment that it lives, namely an ocean in which amino acids are floating around. And so this is a way in which a very small quantity of information has come to exist in this molecule, which before didn't exist. Before there were just different molecules and amino acids floating around. So that's, I would just disagree that it's generally not possible for information to be generated by a natural process. It just takes a huge amount of time and a huge amount of trial and error and natural selection, namely filtering of all the stupid copies, and so that just the productive ones remain, and then again variation and again filtering and so on. So you want to say something to that, perhaps?
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get how you would say that that molecule that you presented as example would contain information in that molecule like DNA would, because in DNA you have all these I think some people call them sort of letters that are sequenced so to have information, but I didn't see that being the case in that molecule that you mentioned. Perhaps I didn't understand your argument, but yeah, I didn't see anything there.
Yes, the information would be contained in the same way, that namely this molecule would consist of different amino acids or different building blocks that swim around in this ocean. And these blocks would be ordered in a specific way, giving this molecule a specific structure. And the form of this molecule, if you want to call it like that, is at the same time also the copying instruction, because each of these building blocks out of which this molecule consists also has the property of very weakly microelectronically attracting the same or an opposite amino acid to itself, so that over time a new copy of the same molecule comes to exist.
Well, you spoke about the form of the molecule and specific order of, you would say, the order of atoms in that molecule?
Yes, but more precisely the order of, let's say, amino acids.
Amino acids. Or you mean the order between distinct amino acids then grouped together?
Yes, let's say the molecule consists of 10 amino acids that are organized in a specific form.
Right, but still I don't see how that would contain information, because in DNA it's not merely that you have a specific order of different molecules, but rather that there is this chemical alphabet, so to speak. I wish I knew more about DNA to articulate the point better, but yeah, information in DNA is something more complex and deeper than merely an order of molecules.
I would disagree, because these 4 building blocks of DNA, I think they are abbreviated with A, T, G, and C. So these are kind of the 4 letters out of which a DNA molecule consists, just in very long strings of different of these letters. And the same can be said, let's say we have 5 different amino acids and 10 amino acids in total that make up this first molecule. And so the molecule would be something like 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 4, 7, 1, 1, or something like that. So the order of these amino acids, the amino acids can also be seen as letters that are combined to make this molecule. So it's the same thing.
So the order of the molecules thus generate these letters, so to speak?
Yes. No, each amino acid would be a letter. And the molecule that can make copies of itself, since it consists of, let's say, 10 amino acids, it would be an information consisting of 10 letters.
But why would, say, one amino acid have one letter and then another amino acid another letter, instead of all being the same, for instance?
Well, because there is a finite number of amino acids, which, for example, let me show you this perhaps. I'll just quickly look that up.
And also, just to rephrase the question, in other words, let's say you have 10 amino acids. What makes such and such letters corresponds to these and these amino acids, in other words?
Yes, I will be right with you. Okay, so these are some example of amino acids. I'm not sure. There seem to be 21 that are important for life. So here we have the lysine example, and this is how this molecule looks. Well, this is a model of this, a description of this molecule. And so whenever the molecule, let's call it, like Richard Dawkins, the replicator. So the replicator is this molecule here, the red one, which is capable of making copies of itself. And so the replicator would consist, let's say, of a lysine and then a histine and then a lysine again, and then perhaps two of these here, and then one of these, I don't know, but every lysine is the same. They have the same stable combination of oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and carbon atoms, and have the same three-dimensional structure, and they exist because they are a stable configuration of these atoms. And so that's why I would always give a lysine the letter K, because it's always the same building block out of which the replicator molecule consists.
Okay, so you were talking about different kinds of amino acids, not merely all being the same.
Yes.
Okay, well, okay, then I see that point, but still, it seems to me to be a gap between, okay, you have different amino acids that are different from each other, have sort of, to some extent, different atoms, etc. But to get from those different chemical conditions to that chemical conditions being used as a language, because that's the thing with DNA, that those different conditions are actually forms of code or language. There seems to be a gap to get to there. And also, yeah, I didn't quite get how you got to starting with just one type of amino acid and then getting to other kinds of amino acids from that. And you talked about replication, but then I would perhaps ask a question: by what means or mechanism can, say, an amino acid replicate itself or reproduce itself?
Yes, I mean, just to go back here again, in this image here, it was perhaps not made as well as it should be. These are all different amino acids, different kinds of amino acids. Let's say, for the sake of the argument, these 21 typical amino acids, all of them float around in this ocean in immense numbers, like billions of billions of billions of each one of these 21 types of amino acids floating around. And each one of these is composed out of nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, and can, just by mechanical shuffling and ultraviolet and lightning, breaking apart some molecules and then atoms combining to new molecules, these amino acids the different types of amino acids can come into existence. So basically you have 21 letters kind of floating around in this ocean.
Right, so you have all these atoms, so to speak, and then they combine together to form different amino acids.
Yes, and they do so because these here are under certain chemical and physical conditions, these atoms are actually stable. So the molecules will have a lower potential energy when they are, or the atoms will have a lower potential energy when they are arranged in this way than if they are floating around freely. Just like if you have a lot of different magnets and you put them all in a cup, then they immediately will start to cling to each other. And the same thing happens on a I don't know, not microscopic, but much smaller level with atoms and molecules.
Well, that would depend on whether the conditions on Earth and in the ocean at that time actually had those conditions to make that stable. But yeah, it seems that we have been talking for a little bit over an hour now, so perhaps we could move on to other considerations of evolution and then possibly return to this subject in the future sometime.
Yes, good idea. I think very good idea. If you want, I could talk a little bit about the bees and the flowers problem.
Okay.
Because there is a possible, and perhaps we will also have to make a part 2 and part 3. We will not probably get through all the arguments concerning evolution. But so I was just thinking, and again, this is not proven. I haven't even read this anywhere. This was just kind of off the top of my head. How could bees and flowers have evolved simultaneously? So let's say we start at a simpler stage where plants typically, or some plants still today reproduce just by producing pollen and throwing it out into the wind. And just when the pollen is carried by the wind and it lands on an open spot, let's say on a different tree, then there grows now a little seed of this tree. So this was kind of the starting point of the evolution of bees and flowers. So we have trees or plants that just spread pollen into the wind, and we have some kind of animal, maybe large or small, that eats this specific tree. So if we assume that these things exist, then what could happen is that this animal, when the tree is spreading pollen and the animal goes and eats this tree, then it gets some pollen on its face or on its hair or whatever its surface is. And then when it goes to eat another plant of the same species, but perhaps it cannot eat the entire plant because it was scared away by a predator, or it cannot reach the entire plant, then it rubs some of this pollen on its hair onto this different plant, and thereby, without even wanting it or thinking about it, helps this plant to propagate, to spread pollen from one place to another plant. And so, because these plants are the plants of this species, they are all kind of competing for reproducing. So the plant which is better able of reproducing will make more copies of itself, and also the plant that needs less energy for reproducing will make more copies of itself. And so what could happen is that some plant starts to just perhaps change the nutritional value of its leaves a little bit, so that this animal will eat this plant more regularly than, let's say, its other plant of the same species. And thereby this animal will more often spread this pollen from this plant to another one. And so the genes for producing this behavior start to spread in the population. And so this plant becomes more and more specialized in attracting this animal by offering it some food and using the animal to spread the pollen from one plant to the next. And at the same time, the animal becomes more and more dependent on eating exactly this plant, because this plant has more nutritional value, let's say, than another one. And this is feasible because the more the animal helps the plant to spread its pollen from one plant to the next, the less pollen this plant has to produce. So it might be more energy efficient to make leaves that this animal actually likes to eat, but produce far less pollen, because now the animal spreads the pollen to the other plant instead of the wind. And so through this process, a plant and an animal can evolve over a long period of time until you have, in the end, a specialized flower where there are very nutritional nectar for the bees, and at the same time the bees transporting the pollen from one flower to the next.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't see how that makes sense. For instance, first of all, that plant which spread the pollen in the very beginning of this scenario, how would that plant survive if it didn't need the bees in that beginning stage? And if it survived by some other means, why would it cease to have that means to survival and then be utterly dependent on the bees? It seems to be many gaps there which cannot be filled.
I don't agree. So in the beginning stage, the plant doesn't need the bee. And the bee is not yet a bee. The bee is just some animal that eats the leaves of this plant. So, but that which happens is that by eating the leaves of this plant and transporting the pollen from one plant, from one individual plant to another, this plant has a little bit of a higher chance of reproducing than this other plant, let's say, which lives on a high rock, so that the animal cannot eat the leaves. And so, because of this little increase in probability of reproduction, over time, the one plant that has its leaves eaten makes more offspring than the other one, even though it still could without the animal, but it just makes a little bit more.
But I don't understand, how does those flowers reproduce, and what role does pollen play in that reproduction mechanism, so to speak?
Yes, but there are trees that reproduce without bees. They just spread pollen into the wind, and other trees catch that pollen, and that's how they reproduce.
Trees that spread out pollen, but they don't need the pollen to survive.
No, they need the pollen, they don't need the bees.
But the flowers, they need the bees.
Yes. But you asked me, how does the plant in the beginning reproduce?
Yeah, and survive, generally speaking.
Yes, just by spreading pollen into the wind.
Okay, but let's suggest that, okay, it was beneficial for it that you had these insects which then spread that pollen by themselves. I'm not sure how would that get from there to it being something beneficial to the flower being utterly dependent on it for survival.
Yes, it will go over a very long time. So let's say in the beginning, the plant reproduces 100% by spreading pollen into the wind. And then some plants happen to make a little bit extra offspring because this animal eats them and thereby spreads the pollen to other plants. So now this plant has like makes how should we say this? It has a little bit, it makes a little bit more offspring. And so as time goes on, the plant that is more attractive to being eaten will spread, and the other plant which only relies on pollen will on the wind will become fewer and fewer. And so now you have a plant which spreads mostly by using the wind, but perhaps 1% of its offspring come from this insect moving from one plant to the next. But let's say this plant needs now only 89% of its energy, but achieves the same amount of offspring, because the spread by the insect is more efficient than the spread by the wind. And so this plant starts now to produce a little bit fewer pollen because it's still enough, because the bees or these eating animals transfer the pollen more efficiently to its destination than the wind. And so over time, the amount of pollen keeps decreasing that the plant produces, and the amount of attraction for the insect keeps increasing until in the end it is completely dependent on the insect to reproduce.
But when you have flowers which began to produce less pollen and be, less capable concerning energy, if that's the correct way to put it, why would natural selection propagate those flowers instead of just sticking to those flowers which continue with the same pollen production as before?
Yes, because when you add the effect of the animal that is eating these plants, then the plants that produce less pollen produce more offspring with the same amount of energy.
Compared to what?
Compared to the plants that only use pollen via wind reproduction.
What about compared to a flower which does use these bees, but it doesn't produce any less pollen?
Yeah, that is the problem. That would be less energy efficient, because the flower, in order to attract this insect that comes to eat, it produces some extra sugar for this insect to eat. And the production of the sugar requires energy, and the production of the pollen also requires energy. And so if you do both of these things 100%, then it requires more energy. But even let's say that the spreading of the pollen via the wind would give some extra offspring to this special flower that you have mentioned, still it would be not energy efficient as compared to using the bees only when you have already made this sugar to attract them.
So the flower would then be better if it produced less pollen because then it needed to use less energy.
Yes.
But why couldn't it do that from the beginning? Why doesn't it need the bees to have this decline of energy production?
Because if a flower or if a plant, without attracting any animal, just produces less pollen and spreads this pollen with the wind, then it would produce less offspring, because the chance of one of its pollen by the wind reaching the right spot on another plant is very small.
Right. But okay, but okay, couldn't you then say that then when the bees or the insects come into the picture, those who continue with the same energy production and does not reduce it, they will produce even more offspring than the flowers, which reduce the pollen. So wouldn't those who continue on the same level actually produce the most offspring?
Not necessarily.
Because
let me draw a quick image. So we have here some plants. Can you see this actually?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have here some plants, something like this. So these are the plants. And now we have some, these plants produce pollen. Let's say they produce pollen here. And this pollen needs to spread to this very specific receptor here of the plant, so that a new seed can grow. So if you just have the wind, then the wind will just blow all of this pollen everywhere. And sometimes by chance, one of these pollen just happens to really land right here. And then a new seed is produced. So if this plant here produced less pollen, then the chance of one pollen reaching exactly the right spot would be reduced. But now, let's say we have here our animal, which looks like this. And this animal comes here and eats this plant or parts of it. And then the animal gets some pollen here is sticking on its fur or something, and maybe one here as well. And now the animal, of course, moves and goes to eat the next plant. But it also cannot eat the whole plant, it just eats certain parts which it can reach. And now it can happen that the animal, by trying to reach parts of the plant, will just bring this pollen exactly into the right place of the plant. And so the pollen has now traveled with the animal and not with the wind. And so if we have here two plants, let's say we don't need this one here, and we also don't need this one here. And so this one here produces a huge amount of pollen, like crazy. And this one produces less pollen. But this one here is more attractive to eating for this animal than this one. And both of them are trying to send their pollen to a third plant to make a new seed, to make a new plant. Now the question is, here we have some wind. So is the wind or the animal more likely to bring this pollen or this pollen to this specific place here on a third plant?
Right, yes, the animal is better suited because it will want to go to those plants.
Yes, that's the idea.
Right, but the wind is more random.
Yes, and so now here, let's say this producing these pollens here cost 100 units of energy, and allows this plant to reach, I don't know, let's say 100 offspring per year. And this here needs only 99 units of energy, but also allows this plant to produce 100 offspring a year.
Because of the animal.
Because of the animal, let's say, then this would mean that the reproduction via animal would be a little bit more energy efficient than the reproduction via wind. In this artificial example. And so this plant here would produce a little bit more offspring than this, and over time, all of the plants would be like this, and or perhaps all of the plants in a certain region would be like this, because let's say this animal cannot live in the mountains. So in the mountains, still the pollination would be the better choice. Something like that.
But then I have two questions. The first question is, why would the animal be more attracted to the flower that produces less pollen compared to the one producing more pollen? And the second question is, even if it's more energy efficient to produce a little bit less pollen while producing the same offspring as in this case, still, if both of those plants produce the same number of offspring, in this case 100, wouldn't it be irrelevant for natural selection because both would produce the same amount of offspring anyway?
Yes, that is correct, but perhaps it would be better to say then that with the same number of energy, this plant produces one more offspring. So if both plants have the same amount of energy, then this one will produce more offspring. And now you are, of course, right that if this plant would produce the same amount of pollen, it would produce even more offspring. But that was the other assumption, that this plant makes some very nice, tasty leaf here that this animal likes to eat a little bit better than this leaf here of the other plant. So this would, in the first instance, this would just be a random instance, like a random occurrence. Let's say just the genes of this plant are arranged in such a way that the leaves contain a little bit more sugar. And so the animal would be more likely to eat this leaf than to eat this leaf. And also just by a small margin, let's say, now speaking of the animal, let's take a different color, I don't know. This leaf here contains 100 units of energy, and this leaf here only contains 99 or even 0.9 units of energy. And because in the beginning, these things are very, very small differences. That's the point with evolution. It's just very, very small changes in the probability of reproducing. But then when you have many individuals over a long time, then this small probability actually makes a difference over time.
Okay, two points. First, okay, so here we see after the adjustment that both produces the same amount of energy, same amount of pollen, but the one produces slightly more offspring than the other. Is that correct?
Almost. Both use the same amount of energy here, 100 units. But this here makes a little bit less pollen. Let's say just 99.9 units of pollen and a little bit more tasty leaves. And this here makes more pollen and a little bit less tasty leaves. So they use the same amount of energy, but in this scenario where they live, this one here produces a little bit more offspring.
And specifically, what makes the one on the left produce a little bit more offspring compared to the other one? If both produces, if the other one produces actually more pollen, then why does the other one produce a little bit of more offspring?
Because the transportation of pollen via animal is a little bit more efficient than the transportation via wind.
Right. But then there is the other question of why does the animal favor the one with less pollen compared to the other one with more pollen?
Because the animal doesn't care about the pollen, it cares about eating the leaf.
Right, but tasty leaves, that could be the case the other way around as well.
Yes, but no, actually not, because having more sugar in your leaves requires more energy than having less sugar.
Okay. Right.
And so we would say that this genetic variation here is a little bit more efficient or better for this environment specifically than this one.
So there is a trade-off between energy producing pollen and energy producing tasty sugar leaves.
Yes.
Right, and those plants which then have a little bit of sugar leaves, but then a little bit less pollen, will thus be favored by natural selection because the animals would choose them.
Yes, in this setting here, yes.
Okay. But but then, okay, where do we go from this then to the end result, because it's still a huge gap to
yes,
close.
Good question. So I will just quickly save this.
And also,
okay.
Another point, if I can just quickly make that.
Sure.
Even if you could say, okay, there are slight advantages for some of these plants compared to others, these advantages might still be so small that they are basically cancelled out by all other sorts of factors in natural selection, because, as you know, nature can have a lot of different factors at play. And this very, very, very slight advantage might be so little, then it wouldn't really matter. It wouldn't actually drive natural selection overall, because there will be these other factors that sort of cancel the relevance out, so to speak, if you see my point. So the question is, how could the advantages be large enough to actually dominate natural selection in its entirety in nature?
Yes, the advantages only have to be very, very small. That's the point. They have to be just a little bit better than no advantage at all, because we have, let's say, over the entire Earth, I don't know how many flowers exist, or let's just say in Norway, how many flowers exist in Norway? I don't know.
A lot.
A couple of million flowers, perhaps. And then we give them a lot of time. Let's say we give them 100 million years. So these would be just a mind-blowing number of flowers. And it is true, some flowers will be eaten and some flowers will be burned by fire and some will be drowned by having too much rain. But all of these factors can hit both this flower here and this flower here, or this plant here and this plant here. But still, whenever they are in the same circumstance, then this version here produces a little bit more offspring than this one. And so just gradually over time, maybe let's say in the beginning, and of course it is possible that this mutation here just dies in the beginning and there is no offspring and then it's gone. That's possible. But once it has reached a certain amount of distribution, and here it would also be important to bring in this notion of the gene pool, but I think it will go a little bit too far at this moment. But just saying that the shift from the current version to the slightly better version will take a long time. Yeah.
There is another point I thought that, okay, so the one producing those sugar leaves will have an advantage because then the animals will come and spread it better. However, you also have the disadvantage of less pollen that is spread by the wind. And it's true that the animal is better than the wind, but at the same time, the one with the wind has more pollen compared to the other. So it seems that there are both advantages and disadvantages for both. So there is this separate question of, okay, what is the total advantage? Who will, when we consider both the advantages and disadvantages, who will be favored by natural selection? That's also another point.
Yes, absolutely true. And of course, the image here is a little bit misleading by now because we have said that actually the difference in pollen is only small, as is the difference in leaves. So this here would have almost as many pollen, just let's say a little bit more. This has 100 units and this has 99.9 units, and this here has 100 units of tasty leaves and this here has 99.9%. And so in the beginning, this plant would also spread via the wind and via the animal. And the sum of both ways of spreading together would give it this slight advantage over the other one. That's the idea.
Yeah, but okay, they produce both. No, but still, the one to the right produces slightly more pollen. And yes, as we pointed out, it is an advantage to have the animal, but at the same time, there's a disadvantage of having less pollen being spread out.
Yes, I will just quickly improve the image so that it makes more sense to what I want to say. So we said this here produces 99.9 units of pollen, and this here produces 100 units. I'm trying to match the colors to the thing we are talking about, so it will be more clear. And this here has 99.9% tasty leaves, and this here 100. Okay, so seeing that this thing produces 100 units of pollen, we can say that the wind benefits it 100 units of transferring that pollen, so that we get 100 units of total reproduction. This is actually bad, sorry. I will have to correct this because this is very improbable, unless these are different units. But sorry, just quickly having to fix something. So let's say 1 out of every 1,000 pollen reaches its destination by the wind. And so this here would produce 99, something like this, number of pollen.
99,900?
Yes, and this here produces 100,000 pollen. And then 100 of these 100,000 actually reach this place in the other plant, and so they produce 100 offspring. And from
Right.
here, because the wind is not discriminating, this here would only produce 99.9 units of offspring. But because the animal is more, what's the right word, efficient, the pollen that gets stuck on the animal will actually add 0.2 units of offspring, and that's why we get here in the end a larger number than in the other instance.
Right, but what if the animal only produced 0.1% extra pollen instead of 1.2?
Yes, that's of course possible. Then the bees and the flowers wouldn't have evolved.
Right. So yeah, and also another thing. Yeah, because I would say that it's an interesting consideration which I brought here, but I don't see anything suggesting that therefore the one producing less pollen and more tasty leaves will therefore overall be led by natural selection. And also another point I would bring up, even if the one with less pollen has slightly little more tasty leaves, I don't think it's going to make a real difference for the animal, because I don't think they're that sensitive that they aren't going to care about 0.1% more tasty leaves compared to others. And I think I'm not certain, but I think the animals are not going to be so selective. I think they're just going to go to the flower and say, oh, it's tasty leaves, I'll take that, and I wouldn't really care about discriminating one who has 0.1% more tasty leaves compared to the other.
Yes, that is of course true. Now, to your first point, you are absolutely right that if any of these numbers here is different, in this specific case, it would be this here and the amount of energy needed to produce pollen versus tasty leaves. The trade-off could also be bad. It could be that this version here is less efficient and only produces 99.9 units of offspring, and then it would just die very quickly and the plant would remain as it is. But the question was, is it theoretically possible for plants and bees to evolve together? And the answer is, it is theoretically possible if these specific weights here are correct or are advantageous. So that's just one thing to mention. And the other thing is, of course, this animal will also eat some parts of this plant, because, as you said, it will not be, because of this slight increase, now only going to eat this plant here. But for the animal, if it can get a little bit more nutrition with the same amount of work, then it will be good for the animal. So the animal, there will also be different versions of this animal, and some of them will perhaps have a little bit finer distinguishing capabilities. And in this case, they will get more energy, and so they also will make more offspring. And perhaps this thing could also be drawn a little bit like this. So we would have here also an animal that also gets, some pollen. This is, I think, even the better way of drawing it. So having to change this here again and this here again. Let's say it's something like this. So 90% come from this here, and and 10% come from this here. So even in the normal plant, 90% of the offspring come from the wind, and 10%. No, that's probably a too large number, but perhaps it should rather be, I'm sorry, making a lot of fuss here, something like 1% and 99%. And so now here it would, now the math becomes a little bit complicated, because now it's 99.9% of 99%, which is perhaps something like 98.9 or something. And the probability here of actually moving some pollen would be something like 1 point. Now I have to do the math so that it adds up.
1.01.
If it were 1.01,
or 1.
that would give, no, 1.02. No, something like that. I'm not exactly sure. Let's see, 100. 1 is 90, 1 is 100. Sorry. Hate this program. It should be, what's going on? (1.2%). Because if you add this to this, then you get 101 and 0.1. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so the point remains that in this environment with this animal and this wind, this configuration is slightly more energy efficient than this one, and therefore over time will probably spread.
Well, yeah, I see the math works there, but when it comes to the animal eating that more tasty leaf compared to the other one, since the tastiness is so small of a difference, I'm not sure how I could see that it will result in a real difference when it comes to the one spreading more pollen than the other animal.
Yeah, I mean, that's a possible objection, but of course, animals are evolved also to optimize their energy efficiency. Because if we have just some, on a very different note, we have here two different animals. And this one here can find a little bit more energy than this one, then it will produce a little bit more offspring than this one. And so for the animal, it's actually important to eat the most energy efficient food it can find. And I'm not saying that it will be a conscious sense, but we would have to depend, for this whole example that I'm constructing here to work, we would have to depend on the fact that animals are quite sophisticated in maximizing the energy that they find. And that's why they evolve together. But yeah.
But would they select those with more tasty leaves over, or wouldn't they just, okay, here is a plant with some tasty leaves and go for that, even if they somehow knew that it wouldn't be as good as other plants, they take it because it's the closest one, or it's the one where they are most safe from predators or something like that?
Yes, let me put it like this. If we have two animals, each spending 100 units of energy to find food and reproduce, then this animal here will actually find 100 units of energy when it eats this leaf, but this one here will only find 99.9 units. And so this animal will be a little bit more likely to produce offspring than this one. And so over time, the animal which is better at finding the more nutritional leaves will spread its genes opposed to this other animal.
So in other words, possess a feature by which you will actually discriminate plants with good leaves from plants with slightly worse leaves.
Yes, and not discriminate extremely, but just a little bit. So perhaps this animal will know instinctively that it's better to walk into this kind of forest instead of that kind of forest, because the amount of plants with more nutritional leaves is a little bit higher in this one type of forest than in the other, or something like that.
Could animals possess such a feature? I'm not sure if biologists have discovered such a feature.
Yes, I mean, not consciously, but just kind of like instinct. I mean, animals have all kinds of instincts for going into certain places or avoiding certain other places.
Would this be said of bees today?
I'm no expert on bees, but I guess that a bee, for example, wouldn't fly onto the open lake because there are no flowers on the lake.
Yes, that's true. Well, it becomes a question of, okay, what do bees do and why? But there's another question. When it comes to flowers today that depend on bees, is it it's the case that those plants or flowers today could not survive if they relied solely on the wind, like those primitive flowers did? Is that because they have, what would you say is the reason or the difference?
Yes, I will like to explain that right now. So this was the first step in this evolutionary process. And so now, after a long time, I will just cut this thing here out. This was our starting point. So we will just kind of keep that here on the side as a reference. This is here our reference. So now, after some time, the situation will be something like this. We have again 2 plants, and these plants again produce some pollen and produce some leaves like this. Whoops, this is a little bit ugly. Okay. But now, again, this new plant here produces only 99,800 pollen. Again, a small variation in the genetic makeup of, because now this first plant here is kind of almost extinct in, let's say, in the forest. In the mountains it still exists, but in the forest now all of the plants are like this. And now one of these plants makes again a small genetic variation and produces a little bit less pollen and a little bit even more nutritional leaves than the first one. And so now the values of their reproductive success would also change again. We have here the animal with the pollen, and so this here, the wind would now on average produce 98.8 offspring of this plant here, and the animal, let's say, will produce 1.5 units of offspring, I don't know. And so with 100 units of energy, this second plant would now produce 100.3 units of offspring compared to the original plant, which now no longer exists. So this third version would be even more energy efficient than the second version, which was more energy efficient than the first version.
Well, okay, well, one thing is to also remember that still there is this disadvantage of less pollen, and we still have to make the assumption that even there, the advantage of having animals spread the pollen is higher than the having less pollen. And the thing is, there's one thing to say, okay, this assumption could be the case in one case of natural selection that we just looked at, but this has to happen over and over and over and over again until it becomes so extreme that we have the flowers we have today. And yeah, that seems to be, I don't see how that could be the case so strongly, that each and every time that there is less pollen and more sugar leaves, it will always be on the some advantageous instead of disadvantageous. And also another question I would also like to ask: why couldn't the flowers in the beginning evolve to have more energy capacity, so to have more pollen and more sugar leaves instead of there being a trade-off?
Well, no, all flowers use the same amount of energy.
Right, but why couldn't it evolve to have more energy?
Well, then of course, having more energy is better, but that's just like saying, if I don't know, if one flower could have more energy by some means, then of course it would also produce more pollen and it would be superior. So being able to extract energy from the environment is probably the most important, or one of the most important characteristics of any living being. But we have just started by the assumption of having two variations of the same plant that are slightly genetically different. And this genetic difference by accident just happens to make one of them produce a little bit fewer pollen and a little bit more tasty leaves than the other one.
But I didn't get why it couldn't be just the case that they evolved to have more energy instead.
Well, where should they get the energy from?
Genetic mutation to be able to absorb more energy.
Yes, of course. That would spread also via evolution if we can make, let me just save this. And we make a new example. So we have here, whoops, let's just see, where is it? We have here plant 1 and we have here plant 2. And no, they both produce pollen, something like this. And this plant here has, let's say, 100 units of energy. And this plant here has 100.1 units of energy. Then this here will produce 100,000 pollen, and this here will produce 100,100 pollen. And so this one will be more likely to spread its genes. And so after a short amount of time, this here will just go extinct, and only this plant will exist in the ecosystem anymore.
Right, exactly. Since according to the theory of evolution, things generally improve over time, since it asserts that fish eventually evolved into amphibians and then better and better and better, and then ended up like very complex animals like monkeys and even human beings. So if you could see this upward trend of complexity and improvement, then it seems to me that flowers could also evolve to have more energy capacity.
Yes,
according to that theory.
Yes, but talking about all other things being equal, the flower that is capable of extracting more energy from its environment will spread compared to the other flower. But also, where is it now? All other things being equal, the flower which with the same amount of energy can produce more offspring will also spread compared to the flower that is less efficient at producing offspring.
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Yes. So if flower A can extract more energy from the environment than flower B, then it will be more successful and by natural selection replace the other flower.
Right.
But if flower C with the same amount of energy can produce more offspring than flower A, then also flower C will be more successful than flower A and by natural selection replace it over time.
But flower A would have all the advantage because it could also have this trade-off between tasty leaves and pollen, but overall it would be better anyways, if you see my point.
Because it had more energy?
Yes, it could absorb more energy, so it would have advantage over flower C as well.
Yes, but now you are confusing two characteristics of this plant that we are trying to look at separately. Both the amount of energy that you can extract from the environment and the amount of offspring that you can produce with that energy. Let's call these two traits of a plant. And both of these traits are trying to be maximized by the process of evolution. So of course, if a plant can have both more energy and more energy efficient production of offspring, then it will spread even faster.
Right. Yeah. Sorry.
But that doesn't mean that if they have the same amount of energy, still this plant here will spread faster than this one.
It doesn't. No, right. Yeah, so my point was rather if you have these flowers with higher energy because they can absorb better, then there would be nothing with flower C that would make it superior to flower A. And not even if the flower C, has tasty leaves, that could also flower A have. So yeah, there is no intrinsic thing that makes flower C superior to flower A, is the point.
Well, we have to agree that the flowers are not identical because of the shuffling of genes in the process of procreation. Each flower has a different combination of genes from the common gene pool. So they are not identical.
That's true. Another way to phrase the same question would be sort of flower C. Why couldn't it have more energy capacity than it already has, sort of? Why would we have to assume that it has the same energy capacity as flower B, sort of?
Yes. Let me ask you this. Why don't you have more energy capacity from the same food that you eat?
From the same food? Because the food is different, you mean?
No, you eat the same food every day, but it would of course be better for you if you could extract more energy out of the same food.
Right.
But, well, that's of course true, but that doesn't mean that it can just be done.
Well, if evolution is true, then over time, wouldn't that happen?
Yes, it would. But I am assuming I'm assuming here that it already has happened so far, that all of these plants have the same level of energy extraction from their environment. As we have said, if we, let's just, it will become a little bit crowded, but let's just put our flower B here. And flower B, whoops, let's put it a little bit up here, can extract 100.1 units of energy out of the environment, and by spreading pollen also produces 100.1 units of offspring, as compared to this one here, because it produces this amount of pollen. Then in that scenario, flower C and flower B would be equally well equipped, but flower A would be less well equipped.
Right. Yeah, when I was talking about flower A, I was thinking about flower B, because I was thinking of the flower having more energy capacity. So suppose you have this flower B then, and this extra energy that it absorbs go to more tasty leaves. So it has all the advantages of flower C, but it can also spread more pollen by wind as well.
You are thinking like something, flower B, something like this. Let me just see. So let's say it produces the same amount of pollen as flower A, but also at the same time, it produces down here a leaf which is more tasty than the leaf of flower A, something like that.
Right.
Like it produces the amount of pollen of A and the leaf quality of C.
Yeah.
Then we would say that because we can see here, so flower A, what did we say, produced 99, I think we said it produces 99 units of offspring via the wind and 1 unit of offspring via the animal. So this flower B here would produce, like flower C, 1.2 units of offspring via the animal and 99 units via the wind. And so in total, it would produce 100.2 units of offspring. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, you could say that, I suppose. Yeah.
So that's actually quite nice. So now we see that it would be more advantageous for a plant to learn how to extract more energy from the environment than to learn just this switch from pollen to tasty leaves. Or, well, no, this has also switched from making more tasty leaves, but we just see B is a better adaptation to the environment than C.
Right.
Well, no, that's not yet true. I'm sorry. Because, yeah, well, I'm not sure if it's true or not. But let's say this plant has it has kind of improved its metabolism here. So it really, from the same environment, it can extract more energy. So then it would be true that the improved metabolism is better. than just this switch here.
Sorry, can you repeat the last sentence?
Yes, I said just if we ignore number plant D for the moment, we just compare A with B and C, then plant B would actually be better suited for this environment than plant C.
Right.
So plant B would become more and more widespread, and both A and C would kind of go extinct.
According to this evolutionary framework that we have been discussing.
Yes.
Right. So,
but still, if
yeah.
I may, if plant B now becomes the most dominant plant in this forest, let's say, then at some point, again, there will be a slight variation in its genetic composition. And so the question will still be, can it improve its metabolism even further, or will there be like a plant E that evolves out of this one, which makes more tasty leaves and less pollen?
A plant E that does what, did you say?
Yes, a plant E. Where can I put it now? Let's just see, making more space here. A plant E that also has 100.1 units of energy and perhaps creating only 90,900 pollen, but creating leaves of quality 100.1 or something like that. So
well,
basically the same as we had here with C, but just, I'm sorry, I did it wrong here. The point I'm trying to make is having a good metabolism and producing less pollen and more tasty leaves can evolve. They are two different traits of a specific plant.
Right. That's true. But in this evolutionary process, you could argue, well, why would, since the total amount of energy, according to this scenario, would be the same, it's just that the sugar leaves would be tastier and tastier, and then less and less and less pollen until we get to the flowers that we have today. But that presupposes that the total level of energy is constant. But if you have this trait alongside the other trait of having more energy, then we wouldn't, you could say, well, why do we still see the flowers today being so vulnerable to extinction without bees, instead of just having this increase in energy to avoid that problem?
Yes, the answer is it's very difficult to extract more energy from your environment. As you see yourself, if there could evolve another species of human being which needs less food in order to live, then it would have an evolutionary advantage, a very strong one. But it's not very simple to just evolve to have more energy. Also, as a plant, if it's not very simple to just evolve a better metabolism so that you can extract more energy from the same amount of sunlight that you get.
Okay, but there I will see this reflects a very deep problem with evolution, because it supposes that all sorts of unbelievably complex features evolve that way. Just think of the eye on the human being, or the cell all those things evolved. So to have a flower produce more energy would be nothing. It would be child's play compared to everything else that evolution is supposed to explain. By the way, just before your comment, it seems that we have been discussing for quite some time now. So I'm thinking we have perhaps be sort of summarizing what we've been talking about and making some last remarks, and then continuing the conversation at, for instance, next Friday or some other occasion, just so that the conversation doesn't become too long. And also I'm thinking of eating lunch soon. So yeah, sorry about that, but that happens with time sometimes.
No. Good point. Also, I think I have said enough to my model of how bees and flowers could have evolved. So it would be good to conclude and then perhaps make a part 2 at a later occasion. Yes, so I don't know. Basically, I'm glad that I could present this understanding that I got from Richard Dawkins of how evolution might have started. And I think we had a productive discussion about information being generated by natural processes, or if that's possible or not, how certain first proteins could have emerged, or your counter argument that the proteins need some DNA or some building plan according to which they are built. And I think we have discussed this idea of irreducible complexity to quite an extent. I'm not sure we will get any further if we discuss it any further, so perhaps we should just leave it at that, and perhaps there are other interesting arguments pro or against evolution that we could look at next week.
Right, so yes, as you said, this has been an interesting and productive conversation. We really dived into both what is evolution. I think that was very good to have a definition. And you talked about a theory about the origin of life, and you talked about bees and flowers to a large extent. We would disagree about these issues, but it was interesting and productive that we got to discuss them. Yes, when it comes to irreducible complexity, I would perhaps make a distinction between things that, practically speaking, would be very implausible that they evolved and became a thing. And then there is the things that you could say are absolutely necessary for existence to have going. So there would be, you could say, different degrees of possibility or plausibility when it comes to irreducible complexity. And also this is something I could learn more about, deepen my knowledge. And yes, there are various arguments, both philosophical arguments and scientific arguments against the theory of evolution that we did not get into today. But this could be something that we could address in a later conversation about these issues, because it is a very large topic. And even though we discussed just some few points here and there, we still managed to use a lot of time on these points. But it was interesting, it was productive, and much more can be said, much more can be discussed and argued about. So yes, I would then conclude by saying thank you, Amos, for joining in this interesting discussion. And I hope you and the audience enjoyed watching and listening. And yeah, we'll probably continue discussing these matters or some other matters about evolution or something related on a later occasion. So then I'll say have a good Friday and a good weekend to both Amos and the audience, and then I'll let you have the last word.
Yes, thank you for wrapping it up. And I agree, it was interesting, and I hope it will be useful to some people in the audience. Perhaps let us know if you like this kind of in-depth discussion. And I also wish you and the audience a great weekend, and I'm looking forward to future conversations.
Thank you. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.